Do you want to fly into this? Put your body into this situation. Neither do I, and neither did the Army back in World War II. In 1936, before the Japanese were to attack Pearl Harbor, the Army was developing TDR-1, which was an unmanned aerial vehicle. It didn't look quite like what we have today, but nonetheless, it was a UAV, powered by radio links like we have today and video feeds from analog. You'd probably never heard about it just because it wasn't funded afterwards, but in 1944, they were used against the Japanese in great effectiveness. 62% of the bombs hit their target, 31 targets hit out of 50. They dropped 2,000-pound bombs, they dropped torpedoes against warships, they hit anti-aircraft nests, they hit bunkers, they hit tunnel systems, artillery, ammo dumps, and they even hit a lighthouse that was being used as the Japanese to spot artillery. Eventually, it was let go. The whole program was shut down and the drones were used as target practice. Part of the reasons were manpower. Why did the Army want to pay a bunch of dudes to prototype the first UAV? They were always one way as well, so it was very expensive. So it fell out of favor. But as we know from the 1990s, the Predator drone, the TDR-1 was formed into something a little bit different. It wasn't like the FPVs that we see today, but it was the same idea. A flying machine controlled by a controller and analog video feed. The operator of the drone had to have direct line of sight on this drone as it was approaching its target. So the pilot would be in a piloted Avenger aircraft with a video screen like this, looking at it with a cloth over him so the sun couldn't get to the screen so that you could actually see it. And from this piloted aircraft, he would pilot the TDR-1. So the TDR-1 had a gyro, so that way it wouldn't flip around when the operator's flying towards the target. And on the screen, it had one simple thing, the altimeter. But FPVs as we know it today, they started back in 2006. That's when hobbyists were starting to fly around with a screen and a controller. And it was pretty simple, it was rudimentary, but wasn't more than 20 years ago. And then by 2008, they started making it into goggles. So that way you have a first-person view of this drone. Again, it was meant for hobbyists. It was never meant for military use. It was just fun to be immersed inside this vehicle. By 2010, the company Parrot ended up making an FPV that was connected to your phone so you had a better picture quality. But FPV racers, people who wanted to fly around obstacles, still preferred the low latency analog, which was 30, 40 milliseconds. By 2010, kind of developing more in 2013, we started to get flight controllers and ESCs that were able to regulate how fast the motors are going to spin, making a smoother flying experience, which was way ahead of its time, but it stuck. Hobbyists wanted a smooth flying experience. They didn't want to throw open their goggles every time they flew. And then in 2013, that's when we started getting DJI drones really going out to the market, all right? Everybody was buying them up, the Phantom, if you guys remember. And that's where consumers could buy an expensive but high picture quality drone that they could control very simply. By 2014 to 2015, that's when consumer parts for regular FPVs were all over the place. You were able to build anything you wanted. You had flight controllers, you had cameras readily available, you had receivers, $20, and then motors. And you could create this thing. Even carbon fiber frames like we have right here. And of course, when that started to become more popular and readily available, we started to have racing. Racing teams were popping up. There was world tours where early on FPV pilots were racing against each other, going through obstacles. And it was all because you could buy these parts online. You have flight controllers and ESCs, making a smooth flying experience, low latency, analog video, and better frames so the drone can be reused if it crashes. During that time, TBS, also known as Team Black Sheep, which has the crossfire radio links that a lot of pilots use, ended up making sub-gigahertz receivers. This one's 915. Again, it's under 1 gigahertz, and they're able to get the FPV to fly much further than originally thought. And in 2019, HD arrived. DJI launched the digital FPV system, which offered great picture quality with the low latency that we're used to from analog devices, which would obviously become very important in Ukraine, which we're getting into. But first we have to talk about ISIS. I think a lot of us know that ISIS was the first ones to start bombing with these small consumer drones. But it started off with them using them as ISR. They want to be able to spot for artillery and mortars. And that was a great way to do it. Instead of having somebody perched up on a minaret, you can snipe that. And obviously that's what I did in Ukraine. So that was the first use of these small, cheap drones. In 2016, ISIS held one of the cities in Iraq called Ramadi. It's got a long history. And one of their workshops was taken over, and that was the first workshop that was developing bombing drones, bombing FPVs. And later on that year, on October 2nd, 2016, we had the first direct use of a drone killing soldiers, which was in the city of Mosul, which is one of the biggest cities that ISIS held. And 2 Peshmerga soldiers found a downed drone, an ISIS drone, and they went up to it, but it was booby-trapped, which led to their deaths, which was the first recorded death of these drones. It was booby-trapped. And January 24th, 2017, ISIS released one of their famous propaganda videos, which was called The Unmanned Aircraft of the Mujahideen, where they showed bombing targets with these small drones, as well as utilizing them for ISR and artillery spotting. Once that came out, forensic teams and researchers would go to the ground that was recently liberated and find these workshops, where they found how ISIS were modifying these drones drones to conduct these bombing missions. They had release mechanisms like servos that were able to drop bombs like we use in Ukraine. They had munitions with tail fins. They had airframes and even supply chains that would give them all the parts that they needed, all these little tiny parts, in order to modify them how they see fit. So the bottom line is that ISIS didn't invent these drones, but they were the first ones to use them militarily, even using them in propaganda videos. And in 2019, during the war in Donbass, where Ukraine was still fighting Russia, that's when Ukraine started using these drone droppers themselves. It was mostly Mavics. They didn't bomb too much. They mostly used them to coordinate artillery, like I said, and ISR. But the idea was there, consumer drones, cheap consumer drones, could be used in this way. But we still didn't see FPVs as we know them today as the #1 weapon in all of Ukraine being used yet. So in 2020 and 2021, the TB2s, the Turkish Bayraktars, you guys know them, they were being purchased by Ukraine for $1 million, $2 million a piece. They were very expensive. They're a lot like the Predator drone, but the smaller units in Ukraine, the infantry, still wanted that capabilities themselves. So they used the consumer drones like the DJIs in order to conduct those missions just as successfully, just a little bit closer. And obviously during that time, DJI was really cranking out some amazing drones. They had optical zoom, they had digital feed, they had all sorts of capabilities that prior was only for the TB2. Now the first FPV to be used in Ukraine was from a Ukrainian unit, the 93rd Brigade, which showed an FPV going through a doorway and hitting some Russians behind it. It was a Kamikaze drone, as we know. But there's multiple claims to who had the first kill. There were a couple units, one of them called Signum, that went to Reddit and said, no, we had the first kill, we just didn't record it. So we don't know exactly, but it was late 2022. Everybody wants to be the first for these things, I get it. Now in 2023, that's when Ukraine really started to go and take these things seriously. Instead of hobbyists and soldiers doing it out of necessity, Ukraine was now actively funding and making these drones in factories behind the lines. The first one was the Pegasus, which was very similar to what you see right here, where you'd strap a bomb to it, it was a kamikaze type, and they used them very effectively. And from there, we know what happened after that. And each of those Pegasus drones were under $500. It was very effective for what it was, which is actually much cheaper than DJIs, which can cost 5 to 10 times more. Now, how they were flying it at the very beginning, and even up until 2024, I went on an FPV mission with somebody, and they were using goggles and a controller. That was it. Just these two things in FPV were doing the trick up until 2024. So guys were still getting away with that. If they had high terrain, they were able to have direct line of sight on this drone, they were able to take out tanks. But pretty much as soon as FPV started becoming a thing, people who knew about radio technology and knew about FPVs, hobbyists, were starting to give the military some more ideas, giving ground stations and better antennas and even relay systems with the repeaters on drones above the trees so you could have direct line of sight without being on top of a hill. There were all sorts of advancements that were happening simultaneously, and it was for good reason. So it was during 2023 that Ukraine really started to fund FPVs. But it wasn't until 2024 that Ukraine would start their first FPV unit, which was formed to go and help the Ukrainian lines. But then in December of 2024, Ukraine was completely committed to these FPVs at this point. I think a lot of it was due to the lack of resources and lack of funding that the US and Europe was giving them at that time because of the failed 2023 counteroffensive in Zaporizhia. But to backtrack a little bit, I want to talk about where FPVs are going in the future. Obviously, we have fiber optics right now. When did that come into play? Well, it was spring of 2024 when Russia was defending Kursk from Ukraine that had invaded. And they used fiber optic drones because the terrain wasn't really allowing FPVs that were radio controlled to get through different obstacles and hit targets effectively, as well as the extensive use of jammers. So fiber optics were the answer, and that's what Russia started developing, which Ukraine later on used, which meant that you had a direct radio and video link to your drone all the way up to the detonation on target. You have to drive it a little bit slower, but to lock down the logistics chain that Ukraine was using to get their forces into Kursk, which originally were just being jammed. They were in densely wooded areas. Okay, it was pretty much safe from FPV drones. These things can't really get through that. But now with fiber optics, what can you do? And it wasn't until December 20th, 2024 that Ukraine had its first video of a fiber optic drone destroying a target. It was a tank. So Ukraine jumped on it as soon as they could. But Russia had already been prototyping this long before that, even back in 2023. So Ukraine still had quite a bit to catch up with. Now in 2025, Ukraine wants to purchase 4.5 million of these drones. Whereas in 2024, they've developed 1.5 million. Now, what were the big moments of FPVs inside the Ukrainian war? Well, the first was 5.8 gigahertz. That is generally what most FPVs use. Somewhere around there, that's what they use for the video link. It gives low latency video, but also deep penetration so you can get into targets pretty effectively. It was also the controls. Because TBS developed long-range receivers, it was now useful for military. You have to go beyond 500 meters in order to hit targets. And in 2015, Betaflight. That is how you program these drones program all the different parts in it, and give you a better on-screen display. Instead of like the early adoption back in World War II, where you only had the altimeter and a gyro, you now were able to give all the data you needed. You could have altimeter, you could have crosshairs, you could have anything you want to put on the OSD. And you could tune it so the motors don't burn out when you add a 1.5 kilogram explosive on it. And obviously the most important part of this was the hobby parts that were available. You could buy all these parts on Amazon. That's what I did. I built this from Amazon. I bought this from Amazon, and I upgraded with parts from Amazon. You can buy all these parts yourself. And that's really why this was effective. That's why it was able to take off. These small units in Ukraine, when they were starting up with FPVs, they were using hobbyist parts, and we still do today. Of course, you're gonna have to 3D print parts or put zip ties, but you can't beat the cost. And now what are FPVs being used for? How is it shaping the world? Well, fiber optics, of course, AI controlled drones, that's coming very, very soon. We're gonna see that probably in the next couple months. And we see swarms that are gonna be coming. All the different engineering and prototypes and developments you see all started in 2023. It was not that long ago, it's 2 years ago. And what we've seen so far, it's pretty scary, and nobody around the world is ignoring this. We see the US military adapting it first in the Marine Corps, but now the Army. We see all of the surrounding countries in Europe develop FPV teams, develop these FPVs, trying to stay ahead of the adaptation race. It really is that. If there's jammers, you have to have fiber optic. If there's fiber optic, you have to have nets, and it just keeps continuing. We see FPVs being used not only as flying machines, but also as boats, so they can stay underneath the radar and they can hit Russian warships, which plenty of companies, including Anduril, are developing right now to defend Taiwan and to arm the US military for a future potential Pacific War against China. So overall, FPV drones have been around for almost 100 years. Now obviously it's gotten smaller, it's gotten more cost effective, but they were even effective back then. And after the military, it became a way for civilians to race around drones, and it became a hobby. It's my hobby. In Ukraine, from early 2023 onward, FPVs evolved through improvisation, mass volunteering, organizational structuring, domestic manufacturing, technological innovation, and it all culminated into operations such as Operation Spiderweb in 2025. So thanks for listening. That is the entire history as I know it, as you guys know it now, of FPVs. There's a much longer history than I imagined, and I just want to share with you guys. So if you want to start today, become a hobbyist, get a controller, get a laptop with liftoff, and fly. That's pretty much it. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys learned something. I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Peace.